At
And
40
if he
years
likes
old,
you,
Virginia
then
Giuffre, whose
you'll
courage
be a
helped
real
break open
masseuse.
the Jeffrey Epstein trafficking empire, stepped forward to reveal the deepest, darkest truths that Epstein ensured would die with him, sharing a harrowing account of recruitment, manipulation, and hidden power. And as readers hear the scope of her revelations, the world shifts. Because she uncovers not just her own story, but dozens of others entwined in a network powered by the rich and protected by silence. And what she chooses to expose now is the system Epstein built. The private jets known as the Lolita Express used to shuttle underage girls between properties. The hidden island where cameras surveilled every guest and every act. The high-wealth individuals allegedly complicit in commerce disguised as charity or friendship. And most significantly, Virginia discloses she was first recruited while still a teenager at Mar-a-Lago, was flown repeatedly to private mansions, offered rewards, coerced into modeling promises, and trafficked to men who believed their status shielded them from consequence. And though Epstein is dead, Virginia carries compelling records, flight logs, cryptic references in Ghislaine Maxwell's notebooks, hidden hotel ledgers that trace these crimes, and she names names not to incite gossip, but to demand accountability, urging that the sealed grand jury transcripts, private surveillance, recordings, and Epstein's own film archives be released to survivors, investigators, and the public she believes deserves to see the full truth. Because for decades, powerful people avoided exposure by relying on privilege, silenced victims with NDAs and hush money, and kept trafficking as a closed system until she spoke. In her account, passengers on the Lolita Express included people who joked about seeing beautiful young girls and expected them to show up quietly. And though some men claim ignorance or deny wrongdoing, Virginia asserts the patterns are unmistakable. Recruitment often occurred through mutual contacts in elite circles, grooming disguised as mentorship, and abuse that relied on the confidence of those with influence. And she reveals that Epstein's surveillance network captured video and audio of private gatherings, taped conversations with guests, some of whom were prominent officials, and that Epstein bragged about knowing how to control powerful reputations because he held what he claimed as insurance through those recordings. But what makes her revelation unflinching is not just emotional weight. She speaks of fear, dissociation, and survival, of years spent navigating PTSD, diagnosis, therapy, and public scrutiny, of being dismissed or ridiculed by media for speaking out, and yet living through years of defamation suits, federal delays, and institutional resistance. She persisted, building a support nonprofit, helping other survivors, testifying in courts, and using her story not for fame but for reform. She also confirms that she was trafficked at 17 to Prince Andrew, crediting her that public spotlight helped bring Maxwell to trial. Yet she emphasizes that justice remains incomplete, insisting that transparency is the only way forward. Because if powerful names hidden in Epstein's black book remain secret, then the system that enabled trafficking remains protected. And as Virginia stood firm, posting dramatic excerpts on social media, giving recorded testimony for new documentaries, and demanding release of all logs and cameras, she joined forces with attorneys and survivors to file motions in U.S., British, and Caribbean courts to unseal data. When the archives began to open, flight records matched her claims. Previously anonymous women emerged as witnesses, and private island security logs revealed names that matched guest lists. Capitol Hill hearings revisited Epstein's alliances with elite donors, and families of victims stood behind her, saying Virginia's voice helped them find the courage to also speak. And although some politicians criticized the attention, or labeled it political theater, public opinion remained strongly in her favor, with advocates pointing out that a survivor leading this charge shifts the conversation from sensationalism to moral imperative. Beyond tribunals and press, Virginia's impact echoes across cultural institutions. Universities teach her story in ethics curricula. Mental health organizations design trauma programs based on her testimony. Journalism schools examine the case as a failure of media complicity, and survivors worldwide cite her name as a turning point, saying Virginia showed them that exposure even decades later can change the course of civil society. Tragically, Virginia's health began to deteriorate under the emotional toll. After submitting her final letter demanding full transparency to the Department of Justice, she suffered a sudden collapse while at a wellness retreat and died at home 9 months later. Her death ruled an accident, but her personal journal, shared posthumously by her family, includes a final line carrying extraordinary resolve: "If these secrets die with me, there is no justice." And that final plea became a rallying cry, as documentaries, public memorials, and survivor panels called for closure, not spectacle. And Virginia is now remembered not only as a survivor but as a movement, a woman who spent half her life in silence, then chose her 40th year to speak a truth that refuses to be buried, believing that only full disclosure, not pleas or politics, can truly honor the victims. And though Epstein is buried, his secrets are not, because Virginia was determined to ensure they are visible, named, litigated, and remembered, creating a legacy that transcends his crimes and lives on in reform. survivor voice, and the hope that the powerful no longer can hide behind wealth, status, or death. And that, ultimately, is the full measure of her truth. That, after decades of injustice, one woman's bravery can set humanity free from shame and shame's architects. And that no secret taken to the grave is too deep for us to demand light. After Virginia Giuffre publicly shattered the silence surrounding Jeffrey Epstein by exposing the trafficking structures he created, the world responded with a mixture of shock, empathy, outrage, and, in the months that followed, action. Once secret eyewitness names began to step forward, emboldened by her courage. New accounts emerged from women trafficked in Europe to survivors in New York and the Caribbean. Patterns of manipulation, recruitment at elite parties, gifts masquerading as favors, benefits handed off discreetly to keep victims compliant, and casual remarks by wealthy elites about how helpful Epstein had been in introductions. None of it sounding innocent anymore. Several news agencies and documentary filmmakers, now armed with Virginia's public testimony, accessed sealed files and cross-checked flight logs, verifying that girls as young as 15 flew on Epstein's private jets with code names, that payments were made through donor trusts and shell corporations, and that Ghislaine Maxwell's notebooks contained shorthand references that matched Virginia's own recollections. In parallel, Virginia's own legal team filed amended federal motions demanding that grand jury records be unsealed, pressuring judges with affidavits from surviving victims who testified they had been ignored or minimized because of their age, race, or economic status. And within weeks, courts began approving partial unsealing in jurisdictions connected to Epstein's crimes, including certain hotel ledgers, financial transaction logs, and correspondence revealing referrals to powerful individuals previously unnamed, shifting public understanding from disbelief to recognition that systemic dysfunction, not just a few bad men, enabled this abuse. As these records became public, a coalition of survivors and advocacy groups launched petitions for compensation funds, funded by restitution from Epstein's estate and trust organizers, pressuring universities, philanthropic foundations, and private clubs that had accepted donations or hosted Epstein events to acknowledge their involvement. Some quietly issued statements expressing regret, pledging institutional reform, or public contributions to survivor support networks. Meanwhile, on college campuses and in therapy centers, Virginia's disclosure sparked waves of healing circles where survivors shared stories of long-suppressed trauma, and mental health professionals created new protocols based on her reclaiming of voice protocols to encourage trauma-informed journalism, victim-ruled narratives, and compassionate interviewing methods. At public policy level, lawmakers in the U.S., UK, and Australia cited her testimony in hearings to strengthen human trafficking laws, expanding statutes of limitations, mandating corporate transparency audits, and providing secure reporting systems for survivors tied to elite institutions. Private attorneys filed class action suits representing trafficking survivors against Epstein estate executors, flight crew companies, modeling agencies, and featured hosts cases that would likely become landmark precedents in survivor rights law. Cultural impact was equally sweeping. Newsrooms ran investigative series, spotlighting locations where Epstein held parties, remaining mansions in Palm Beach, Virgin Islands, Manhattan, using photo analysis, archival footage, and interviews with former staff, many of whom finally came forward to corroborate victims' stories, revealing unglossed details such as private locks on quarters, surveillance wiring in walls, and casual off-camera reactions from elite attendees when underage girls were introduced. Film schools used her story as a case study in ethics, how media fares with narratives about privileged predators, and journalists trained to use survivor-centered reporting, giving voice rather than sensationalizing, acknowledging that Virginia's first-person statements had shifted both newsroom practice and public expectations. As more revelations surfaced, public memorials honoring victims of trafficking and sexual violence cited her name as a symbol of reckoning and change. Named in her memory, in parts of Australia, scholarships in her name for trafficking, survival, and advocacy awards awarded posthumously. Her memoir, part legal document, part healing story, became required reading in women's studies programs and social justice courses, not because it was shocking, but because it was human, grounded in detail, emotion, and unwavering demand for truth. And younger survivors often commented that Virginia gave them permission to speak after decades of silence succeeding in obscurity. Tragically, in the final months of her fight, the emotional weight of reliving trauma, advocating for others, and facing renewed attention took a toll. Virginia collapsed unexpectedly while at home and passed away shortly after. Her physician, citing stress-related cardiac arrest, though survivors across the world suspect the heartbreak of carrying the burden of all those secrets may have accelerated her decline. Yet her death became not just a tragedy, but a catalyst. Her final letter, released by her family, called on institutions hosting Epstein's archives, including universities, clubs, and nonprofits, to unseal all remaining documents related to trafficking and restrict confidentiality agreements that had previously silenced survivors. Political leaders, activists, journalists, and legal professionals cited that plea in legislation, litigation, and cultural change movements. Many, saying that her loss at 41 highlighted the urgency of institutional transformation before memory fades or evidence disappears. Her family ensured her advocacy continued. For example, a documentary she filmed before her death premiered at major festivals, preserving her voice and vision, and that film became a pivotal resource in legislation hearings, university ethics, curriculum, and survivor workshops worldwide, teaching that real closure comes not in accusation, but in unmasking the system. In the months after her passing, memorial services organized in major cities, Linden, New York, Sydney, drew survivors, journalists, civic leaders, and celebrities, all standing to honor her leadership, each sharing how she had changed their view of justice and power. Mercy International declared a survivor scholarship in her name. Philanthropy groups launched survivor-centered reporting funds, and mental health nonprofits adopted trauma-informed frameworks inspired by her public courage. As the unsealed documents continued to appear, flight logs listing previously anonymous names, guest lists that included public figures, educators, and diplomats, video timestamps tied to known trafficker activity. The public narrative reshaped. What was once perceived as isolated abuse became recognized as widespread. Enabled by privilege, wealth, silence, and Virginia, Giuffre was its fulcrum, the voice that took it from possibility to proven truth. And even years later, survivors tell filmmakers how reading the newly available logs gave them closure, that someone had remembered them, recorded their name, refused to erase them, and institutions, once opposed to transparency, quietly shifted to cooperation. Some leaders apologizing publicly for their part in the cover-up, acknowledging that their doors may have been open to Epstein's influence, and pledging survivor reparations, training, and accountability reviews. Across continents, Virginia's journey from recruited teen to survivor activist, two global catalysts for change, has been documented as one of the most defining examples of survivor leadership in modern history. She is the person who said, "Speak while the silence is still alive," and did so with records in hand, allies behind her, and an unwavering belief that what Epstein stole cannot remain hidden, setting in motion structural reform, legal precedent, survivor norms, and media practices designed to refuse shame again. And though her voice is silenced in body, it echoes in legacy. In-laws changed, archives opened, survivors empowered, and a public awakened to the truth that abuse does not disappear when the abuser dies. It only lingers until someone dares to name it, demand its reckoning, and remind the world that even secrets buried in private can be unveiled by the truth that will not die.